Good morning, everyone. From my side, welcome to this ETIPWind workshop entitled Making Europe's Grid Fit for Climate Neutrality. My name is Adrian Timbush, and I'm the chairman of the executive committee of ETIPWind. As you see in the chat window, right, we have some housekeeping items that we would like you all to obey. So please mute yourself and your microphones. Turn off your cameras as well, unless you are speaking or you are a speaker, and use the chat window to pose questions, but at the same time rank questions with the like features. So, as I said today, a tight agenda, but very good topics to be addressed in our workshop here. And as the title says, this is a workshop, so let's keep it interactive. Please be active with questions and be part of the discussions. We will start, and Raquel, I'm not sure, but I don't see the slides anymore from your side. So maybe you need to reshare the screen there. But we will start with a keynote presentation from Joachim Balke, who is the head of units, infrastructure and regional cooperation at the European Commission. And then we will have a continuation with 3 sessions where we will discuss policies, technologies, and the implementation of these technologies across Europe to meet the targets that we have there. So the first session will be Fit for 55 package, policies and investments. We will also have 2 speakers there. The second session we will be discussing about enabling technology to deliver climate neutrality, and this will be moderated by Vasiliki Klonari, who's the senior analyst on digitalization and system integration at Wind Europe. And then the last session is how to deploy the grid technology and the Europe needs for net zero economy. And this is moderated by Daniel Freile, who is the Director of Market Intelligence at Wind Europe. With that, I wish you enjoy our workshop today. And as I said, let's keep it very interactive. Let's all be part of the discussions here through the chat window and posing the questions. We'll have presentations, but we also made sure that we have enough time for discussions. With that, I pass the word to Joachim.
So good morning, also from my side. And first of all, thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me this morning to speak at this workshop on power grids and climate neutrality, which is, I think, a very, very important subject. I would just perhaps ask whether you could put the slides on from your side that I sent. Here they come, perfect, this morning. Thanks very much for that. So I think it's indeed crucial to talk about the role of power grids when we talk about the European Green Deal. We do like to think that we have perhaps the best and most secure power grids in the world already. But I think everybody gathered here this morning in this workshop would also agree with the assessment that these power grids still have a long way to go to be fit for climate neutrality. The challenges to get there and to bring about the change in our power grids that is needed in a timely manner are enormous. And that's why I think it's good to dedicate this workshop to the subject. Now, if you go to the next slide, I want to speak mainly about, indeed, our infrastructure policy this morning, and the TEN-E policy in particular, for which I'm responsible in the Commission. But allow me to set it very briefly into the context of the clean energy transition. Now, we've set very much the stage with our strategy on system integration early in the mandate, which shows that clearly, if you like, at the top of the pyramid, the one key development that we have is, of course, that renewables are going to make up for an ever increasing share in our energy supply. That means, first of all, renewables in the power system, because electrification, deep electrification, will be a key factor in the energy transition. We will have to electrify some sectors which are not yet electrified today, at least partially, such as transport and heating and cooling, and that will result in an increased demand for power and an increased share of power in our overall consumption. So that means electricity from renewable sources, but there are also some sectors which we sometimes call harder to decarbonize sectors, where electrification alone will not do it. And for that, we will also need renewable fuels and also to a certain extent low carbon fuels. Of course, we should never forget that efficiency remains another key component of how we can reach climate neutrality. We do have to ensure that we don't use more energy than needed. But the key thing that I do want to stress from the outset is that even if we use all the efficiency potential that we have, and we have to use it, that will not do away with the need for additional power grids. I think we also have to be clear about that. And the investment needs to get there are enormous. If we come to the next slide, just to put a few numbers on what we need in terms of renewables. Clearly, we are today more or less at 20% of renewables in our overall energy mix. The objectives that we have currently agreed with the member states and the parliament are for 32% in 2030, so in less than a decade. And what we've proposed now in the Fit for 55 is that this needs to be increased to 40% overall, and that means for electricity to about 2/3. So in less than a decade, we will have to supply more than, or around about 2/3 of our power supply from renewables. That is clearly a massive challenge with a massive impact on our power grids. If we come to the next slide, this is just to add, and I'll touch upon that briefly now when talking about the 10-year review, that while power demand is going to go up and renewables are going to be an ever-growing share, of course, fossil fuel consumption will have to wind down, in particular and very rapidly, of course, for oil and solid fuels, but also importantly for gas. Gaseous fuels will be a smaller part in our energy mix, and the natural gas that is today in our system will have to be gradually replaced with renewable and low carbon gases, and also to a significant extent with hydrogen in all scenarios leading to net zero. In particular, post 2030, we do need a significant ramp up in hydrogen. The one element I want to mention here still, if you look at the graph at the bottom right corner, the renewable energy mix, here we see, of course, you all know it, that wind is going to be the biggest single source of our energy supply. And we see in particular that offshore wind, which today in terms of the production is still a relatively small share, will have to really make a huge step. We'll really have to leapfrog in terms of the amount of offshore wind that we will need on the system to get to net zero. So if we come to the next slide, allow me to say a few words about what that means for our infrastructure policy. You all know the 10E regulation, which has been rather successful over the last decade in ensuring that we have an infrastructure in electricity and gas which is secure, which allows a choice of suppliers, in particular for gas. There we've come really quite a long way, and which also has a good degree of interconnection between the member states and regions in the EU in electricity, which is obviously a precondition to integrate large shares of renewable electricity in the system, in particular variable renewable electricity. This being said, this process is not finished. I mean, in particular, when we look at the levels of interconnectivity of the power grid, there are still some regions in Europe which are not sufficiently integrated with Central Europe, with the internal market. looking at the Iberian Peninsula. We're also working still on the synchronization of the Baltic grid with the EU power grid. Here, clearly, we do need to continue. But in particular, what informed the proposal for a review of the 10E regulation that we proposed at the end of 2020, that's clearly the need to align our infrastructure policy with the 2030 and 2050 climate and energy targets and climate neutrality in particular, having in the back of our mind the change in the energy mix that you saw on the last slide. Now, allow me just to run quickly through a number of the main changes we have proposed. So if you go to the next slide, without taking too much time, I do want to stress that the topic of offshore grids is a particular priority for us when it comes to the proposed 10E revision, because we do think that looking at the power grid, offshore is certainly perhaps the big challenge, or at least it's the big challenge which has a cross-national European dimension. There are other challenges, of course, with the grid, but which are perhaps more efficiently addressed at a national level. Offshore grids, we believe, are an inherently transnational exercise, and that's why we've proposed a number of things in the 10E review. In particular, the idea to come to integrated offshore development plans on a sea basin level. We think that is important. That follows from the offshore strategy that I'm sure you've all read quite some time ago, which does portray, which does estimate that we will need 300 gigawatts of offshore renewables installed in 2050. That is an enormous amount. And that can only be efficiently integrated into our energy system, into our electricity system, with integrated offshore grid planning. There is also an important element, an important role for sector integration in this context, because it is usually assumed that this offshore renewable generation will, to a certain extent, also be used for hydrogen production. So we've proposed in particular the integrated offshore development plans. That's, for me personally, also really a key element of what we've proposed in the 10E. That should go hand in hand with the system to allocate costs and benefits in an efficient manner between all actors and member states involved. Not an easy task, but probably one of the key issues which has to be resolved for those integrated grids to emerge. And just to say briefly that we've also tried to, let's say, modernize to a certain extent the smart electricity grid category that we have already, to make it more attractive, and possibly enlarge the number of projects that we can expect. We have, as you'll all be aware, proposed to exclude fossil fuel infrastructure from the future 10E because we think it's no more needed, certainly not oil, and in our assessment also we don't need additional cross-border gas infrastructure, and we therefore think that should best be phased out. As you know, that's going to be one of the main topics of discussion with Parliament and Council. And we have also proposed to include hydrogen networks in the future and electrolyzers above a certain size threshold, in particular because we think it's important to have an integrated planning framework between electricity, hydrogen grids, and electrolyzers in the future at a European level, in order to be able to optimize, let's say, the interplay of these elements in the infrastructure. If we quickly move on, not to use too much of your time, just to say on planning, we have proposed to optimize a bit the system that we have today in terms of the 10-year network development plan, by integrating them more closely over the different sectors I mentioned, in particular going forward then electricity and hydrogen. We've proposed also, as I said, to include in particular an integrated planning framework for offshore with a more top-down element in it, and in all of that it is of course important also to keep the energy efficiency first principle into account, so to be sure that we identify infrastructure which is really needed in those cases where efficiency policy alone cannot achieve the same objective. If we go one step further to the next slide, just perhaps this is a point still worth making. identifying the right categories and having the right planning is the first important precondition for, let's say, ensuring the infrastructure will be in place for all those renewables. But at the end of the day, it is often then in the more nitty-gritty permitting procedures, which are very important, that we encounter the real obstacles and the real delays in realizing the projects, which of course we do have to overcome. That's where we've taken another look at the permitting provisions in the current 10E, which have been efficient, which have worked to a certain extent. They have reduced the number of years that is needed for permit granting for key PCIs. But this being said, there's still a couple of PCIs which are delayed, and that's why we've tried to assess what's the reason for that and where we can, in a sense, fine-tune and further improve and strengthen the permitting provisions. Again, we've identified in particular offshore where we do think it is important to have one, we call it one-stop shop, so sort of one window per sea basin, which allows in particular promoters of integrated and more complex projects, such as hybrids, to have a common point of contact in those offshore sea basins. We have also proposed to clarify certain elements in the permitting regime to avoid that there's a doubling, for example, of certain consultation procedures, which isn't necessary, and to accelerate court proceedings where applicable in the way that we've already proposed, that we had already accelerated permitting procedures in the current 10E, but we realized that it is often then before courts that projects are stuck. Now, all this is important because, as I said, without realizing those projects on time, we will have a problem with the clean energy transition. Now, we can skip the next slide in the interest of time. So I will directly come to the conclusion and say that we are currently negotiating our proposal with the Parliament and the Council. The Parliament has just this morning, it's just yesterday actually agreed on its position for entering negotiations in the so-called trilogues. We think this mandate will be confirmed today, and if that's the case, then we can indeed start discussing, hopefully very, very soon, with Parliament and Council a possible compromise, which we of course hope will safeguard those essential elements that I mentioned. It is important that this happens quickly, so that we would be able to have the new framework in place in time for the next PCI list, the 6th PCI list, to be based already on the current provisions, and ideally speaking, to include already some projects in those new categories that we have proposed. That's all from my side. Thanks very much. As I wrote to you earlier on, I apologize that I have to that I cannot stay for the discussions later this morning. So I don't know if there are any immediate urgent questions to be asked right now. Then of course I'd be happy to answer them. And otherwise, one more time, thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very much for being with us this morning, Joachim. Until maybe the colleagues here in the chat will bring some questions, I have a few from my side, right? Let me start with, I think you framed mainly what we see and what we also highlighted in our report from ETIPWind side, some of the key aspects to get this Fit for 55 targets in place, right? And one it is on the renewable side and making sure we have the right grids there to capture all of that. But one of my questions is about electrifying the loads, right? A lot of these loads are connected, particularly or mainly in the distribution networks, right, at different voltage levels there. How fit do you see the grid there, and what do you see the main roadblockers that we will need to eliminate to accelerate there and making sure that we still have that reliability and quality of supply for these users?
Yeah, thanks very much. Indeed, as you say, there is a huge challenge also for the distribution grids, and we are fully aware of that. The fact that we ourselves are perhaps focusing a bit less on that is simply due to the fact that the 10E, of course, is an instrument which very particularly looks at cross-border infrastructure with a cross-border impact, which is not so often the case, let's say, for the distribution grids. But this being said, there are, of course, quite a number of programs on EU level which specifically allow member states also to modernize their distribution grids. We do also have a few smart grid projects on the PCI list, and we will have a few on the next one. I think it's common knowledge and fair to say that a big and important factor is indeed digitalization, making the grids more smart. Again, probably this will not do away entirely with the need for more copper in all places. That will probably also be needed, depending on the state of the distribution grid. That is something that member states and regional authorities are better able to judge in which places this is still needed. But I think what we do see certainly as a cross-cutting tendency is that making the distribution grids more intelligent, but also, let's say, enhancing the cooperation, both in terms of planning, but also operation between the different levels of the grid. That does remain an important challenge, because we do already face a situation, we will do it more often, where power, for example, fed into the distribution grids at local level will have to be moved up also and somehow then distributed via the transmission grid. And that is something, of course, that the grids were not built for, so that does require a new architecture.
Thanks. There is a question here in the chat, maybe directly related to this, is how many times of electrical grid infrastructure would you assume is needed to electrify Europe? 2 times more, 5 times more, or 10 times, even 10 times more? Have we run any scenarios and looked at what is needed, or we are in a process of doing that?
What we have looked at is the question of what this means in terms of investments. And when you look at investments, our assessment is that that's at least the last modeling that we did, the annual investment in the power grids that we've seen over the last decade would have to double on an annual basis. Again, probably not all of that is copper, but some of that will be copper. So indeed, an enormous challenge also in terms of expanding the grid. There are some additional, and there are also some additional sort of high voltage cross-border links which will be needed. I think that's pretty clear.
Very good. And let's hope we will have those investments available such that we can do it. And another question here from Daniel Freile is, for the integrated offshore development plans, I understand, will these plans also combine joint power and gas/hydrogen infrastructure, or are we still keeping the 2 energy carriers separated?
We do think this is an important element. Now, in a first instance, it seemed crucial for us to come to a different way to plan the power grids offshore, because that's the sort of key missing building block that we've identified. So in that sense, this is the first sort of additional instrument that we proposed, integrated offshore power grids, because we don't have them yet. But this being said, it is of course useful to think that from the beginning, also in a system integration perspective, and where useful to already include the possibility for example, offshore production of renewable hydrogen. We do have, by the way, also PCIs on the list, which at least on a sort of conceptual level already include this idea, such as the North Sea Wind Power Hub. So that is something that is being developed, but I mean, let's also be aware that these considerations are for the moment, as I said, on a more conceptual level.
Okay, very good. Let's change a bit gears and move to permitting. Right? Again, referring to the report that we did from ETIPWind earlier before the summer, permitting is one of the key roadblockers that we see in really accelerating and reaching these targets that the European Commission wants us to have. At the same time, we realize the system moves with the speed that it moves. You highlighted here a few topics to look at, but how optimistic are you that we are able to, change or adapt or adjust the current practices to really become faster in permitting of projects and allow the industry to flourish around?
Well, I think we will have to. I think there is no alternative, and I think we also have positive examples. It all starts, so at least to a large extent, it all starts with, let's say, I would say an inclusive approach, which consults with all impacted communities at an early point in time. When those communities have the impression that they're really being part of the development of the project and not being faced with a sort of final decision which they cannot change. We have on numerous workshops, for example, we've had presentations from the colleagues who are building the Celtic interconnector between France and Ireland. So, okay, that's an offshore link, but nevertheless, which shows how things can be done in a positive manner. But of course, we also know, we all know a number of projects, and I won't name them, which have been on the books for far too long. I think the pressure to overcome those obstacles will simply grow, because there is no way to do it alone with local solutions. Local solutions are an important part, but it will not be possible to reach these enormously ambitious objectives with local solutions alone. And I think that is something that that everybody starts to understand, and that makes me a bit more optimistic, at least.
Okay, very good. And now, talking about optimism and so on, what do you expect from the current proposals that you have put on the table? That what will be the outcome and the feedback also from the member states on it?
Now, it's no secret that the discussions are not easy because member states have different starting points. Some member states are still at a point in time, for example, where they have where they attach a higher importance to completing, for example, their gas grid. That is true. But again, I mean, I prefer to be a bit more optimistic. I think ultimately we're talking about the, let's say, the speed of transition or the length of transition phases. I think nobody puts into question the direction of travel. And I think that is also already an important part of achieving a consensus. So I think everybody agrees that after X years, and we're basically discussing how many these are, the priorities that we have put on the table, offshore grids, electricity grids more largely, hydrogen networks, smart grids, are the ones that we should look at. And I think that's an important achievement already.
Yep, I fully agree with that, and let's hope it will go in that direction. Good luck with all the discussions there. Thank you very much once again being with us this morning here, opening up this important workshop for the industry as such and all the stakeholders around to understand what do we need to do for putting that. Joachim, thanks again. Take care. Bye-bye.